if I didn't have this second chance, I would be doing the same thing I'm doing now, just behind the wall, you know. So I'm not the same person that I was at 18, 45 days to my 18th birthday. It didn't take me to be 50 to make a change. I've changed in my late 20s. I spent my 30s, my 40s, and, you know, finally, thank God, was released at 50. It didn't take that long for me to change. So I'm not the same person. So I think it's important to realize that, like Kenneth said, the worst choice that you made as a young person shouldn't define who you are.
You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Kosi Ogbuli. Welcome to the show. Life without parole sentences have skyrocketed in California over the last 3 decades. For the nearly 56,000 people locked away in perpetuity, the punishment is death in slow motion. Kiilu, Washington was given a life sentence without parole and spent 32 years in prison. During his sentence, education, reflection, and mentorship transformed his life. 3 years ago, he was given a second chance at life and freedom. Today, his experiences inspired the mentorship he provides to incarcerated youth from his community. He joins us to share his story. Welcome to the show, Kiilu.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
No, the pleasure is mine. Also with me is Amanda Leavell. Amanda is a researcher and advocate in the Children's Rights Division here at HRW. She is the author of HRW's new report on the reintegration of people sentenced to life without parole, titled, I Just Want to Give Back. Thank you as well for joining us, Amanda.
Thanks for having me, Kosi.
Kiilu, I want you to, set the scene again for us. Could you please share with us the nature of the crime that led to your sentencing of life without parole?
Yes. First, I would like to say, at 18, my thought process was totally different than it is now. So looking back to 1988, my thought process was, my neighborhood is my neighborhood. It's okay for me to sell drugs in my neighborhood, but if you don't belong to this neighborhood, you can't come set up shop and sell drugs over here. And so we had a rival drug dealer. He came, tried to set up a drug operation in the neighborhood. We had a conversation. He seemed to be pretty receptive, but continued to sell drugs. And I hatched a plan. We were going to create a fake drug buying situation, drug deal with him, and we were going to rob him. In the midst of us exchanging the money and the drugs, we threatened him. Me specifically, I threatened him, and he ended up killing my co-defendant. And I tried to retaliate at that moment, and I shot at him, and I shot who I thought at that time was his partner. It was his girlfriend. I realize now, with most young women that were dealing with drug dealers, that she was just along, for the ride. She was not his partner. She was his girlfriend, and just trying to do any and everything to be accepted by him. And I thought that would be the best way to retaliate, since I couldn't get to him, was to shoot her naively.
Wow. Okay. So that's powerful context, and it's appreciated. And the follow up to that, to kind of dive into the conversation now, is what led up to that moment.
That's a very deep question. A lot of things led up to that moment, actually. Feeling unwanted, unloved. I felt like no one cared about me, and I didn't care about myself. My environment was very, very negative. So I got involved in everything under the sun, to be honest with you. And as a way of taking care of myself, I hustled in the streets. That kind of started me down this negative path.
And could you, lead us up into that moment after the incident, in the shooting involvement, and now you're sentenced with life without parole. It's a life sentence, for that matter. I'm curious, during your sentence while serving, how did you grow? What were the moments of reflection like? And was there a moment or a person that allowed you to really understand the gravity of your actions?
No, it was gradual actually. So there were several moments and several people. One individual that just stands out in my mind is a lieutenant, Calvin Campbell III. I met Mr. Campbell, Lieutenant Campbell, probably about 15 years before my change actually started. And I always appreciated him because he used to share personal things with me. Like he had three daughters. He grew up in San Francisco, played football for San Jose State. Didn't always make the best choices, So started off a little rocky, got some breaks, became a correctional staff. And I think a lot of us respected that about him, that he was from the streets. And so he was very empathetic, very stern. But when I think about what an example of a man supposed to be, he was my example on what a man was supposed to be, the way that a man was supposed to take care of his family and function. So he was very instrumental in my change.
Could you go into a little bit more detail as to, who he was and what exactly or how exactly he had such a tremendous impact on your life?
Sure. Lieutenant Calvin Campbell III. I met this specific lieutenant maybe early in my incarceration. And I always admired him because I was one of his clerks, and he always shared personal things with me, pictures of his kids and some of his own experiences, right? And it kind of mirrored mine a little bit. Like he wasn't squeaky clean, but made a major change in his life. And like I truly believe once you put that positivity out there, you get that in return. And so I think he was blessed with, becoming a correctional officer and had a major impact on my life because I knew I never had a positive male role model in my life before. And I looked at him as that role model and I want to emulate that. Really didn't know how I was going to do it while I was incarcerated, but he always supported me. Even when I did something foolish, got in trouble, I see him again and he'll say, well, what did you learn from that? Or one of the major questions that started my road to change was I was getting out of the SHU. They were sending me back to Pelican Bay, and he had pulled me out and allowed me to call my family to let them know Monday I was leaving. And before I left his office, he said, man, I want to ask you a question. What do you think the victims and their families did for the holiday, and how do you think their family feels? And I was so embarrassed because I couldn't answer that question because up until that point, I never thought about my actions, how it affected the victims, how it affected the families, the community, any of that. And he said, no, don't answer that right now. He said, I'll see you again. And when I do, I want you to answer that. And I went back to my cell, and that's the first time that I broke down and cried because I was embarrassed. So that started that one question, and who he was and how much I respected him started me changing my thought process.
Wow, that's so powerful, and and it's fortunate, having that interaction. It's allowed you and allows you now to, ultimately be released and be let out of prison. And Amanda, I want to loop you into this conversation. Your research showed that the majority of people serving life without parole are actually rarely let out. Do you anticipate this to change in the future, or is this a tough on crime mentality that's here to stay?
Kosi, that's a really good question. And I guess the answer is probably not a satisfactory answer, but it's just really hard to predict. I think it's complex. It really depends on a lot of factors. Not even just LWAP specifically, but I think like our criminal justice system as a whole. Like there's so many considerations. You think about society's attitudes towards how we treat people who are incarcerated, public opinion on the topic, politics. It's a really heavily politicized issue, and different debates around criminal justice reform. And I think when you think about the era of mass incarceration, like 70s to the early 2000s, we're kind of in the tail end of that now. In the 2000s, you've seen like gradual shift in the opposite direction, like incremental progress towards reducing that mass incarceration when we've realized this doesn't work, and this is not a good way of going forward. And so we've seen advocates pushing for alternatives to incarceration, like reducing mandatory minimums or trying to have more rehabilitation programs. But a lot of those reforms have largely focused on low level offenses, so like drug offenses, things that like that, and that's kind of on one end. But on the other, you also have the death penalty. Like you hear a lot of people wanting to abolish the death penalty, but what's kind of, I feel like, been lost is that middle, that this, there hasn't really been an emphasis on long prison sentences like life without parole. And so, yeah, I think it's really hard to predict, but I would say that our hope is that people like Kiilu, people like some of the ones that we've interviewed in this report, are going to be the foundation for that future, that just like witnessing their lives and what they're doing with their second chances. That is the best evidence, I think, as to why we should not have the sentence.
Can you please tell us more about your report and what you saw in common among the findings?
Yeah, sure, Kosi. So I think this report is something, it's been a few years in the making. I think I've had the great honor and pleasure of working with a lot of people who were formerly sentenced to life without parole. And like, I am not exaggerating, they are some of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. And one of the things that we realized is there was a gap in the research. Like, we have, in some sense, numbers, statistics of recidivism, but there's never anything more to that, right? So we say like, okay, these people are going back to prison, but what is happening to people who, when they come back, there's kind of no face to that. And that was kind of our intention with the report, was not only say like, hey, there's really low levels of recidivism, but like, what are these people doing now that they've been given a second chance? And the findings, they weren't astounding for me because I know them, some of these people so well, but it was just, to see it and on the aggregate was really, really amazing. That, yeah, it confirms so much of what we knew, that these people are mothers. I mean, well, yeah, mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters. They're taking care of their families. They're working over 40 hours a week. Most of them are working full or part-time. They are volunteering in their communities. They are working for nonprofits. Like, just, it's kind of like the whole gamut. And I think, yeah, some of the common threads were just this desire to give back. You've heard Kiilu speak to some of the things that he's done since he's been released, working so many work with children, and are volunteering in their communities. And those were, I think, some of the most consistent common themes throughout the research.
To really, encapsulate what you said, it's a level of complex politics, but also complex processes that inform the ability for one to be able to have a second chance. And you know and I'll pose this question to you, Kiilu, because this commutation process, a lot of individuals may not know that there's a process to be formally let out of prison. It's incredibly long and difficult from what I've read on it. For instance, both the district attorney and the California Parole Board have to sign off on an appeal. And based on your personal experience, what was the most challenging aspect of this process?
When I initially filed for the commutation application, it was in 2013. I didn't get interviewed to 2018. To be honest with you, I try to stay upbeat and positive, but my reality psychologically was I'm never going to get out of prison. And I was to be honest, I was okay with that. I wanted to work on myself as a human being to be the best version of myself I possibly can. And I think in the midst of that, all these positive things started happening to me. When I changed my attitude, I changed my approach to the people that I was incarcerated with, to staff, just in general, But it was 5 years before I actually got an interview.
Wow. So, can you add a little bit more details? So you got the interview. So what happens? What follow interview happens? What are the maybe the next steps following that?
Well, once you're interviewed, you're asked a series of questions on like why you did what you did, what was integral in your change, helped change your mindset. Why were you seeking education and just betterment, period, if you never was getting out of prison? After the interview, they don't give you any indication whether it was a successful interview, how you did. So that's a little nerve-wracking as well, right? And you try to keep family and friends and your support system like even keel, because they're excited about you getting interviewed. But I personally know several people that was interviewed before me and around the same time, and they still incarcerated.
Wow. No, and Amanda, this is a great place to bring you back into the conversation because, like Kiilu said, there were so many other individuals that went through the same process that didn't get released, and Kiilu was one of 200 prisoners that were serving life without parole that were granted parole over this last decade. Uh, from your perspective, why is this number so small? Is it the appeals are just getting outright rejected? Is it the prisoners that are unaware that they could be petitioned to be released? Is it a combination of both?
Yeah, well, and just to clarify, so like Kayla was one of probably less than 200 here in California, but there are some in other states. But like across the board, there are about 56,000. You said earlier that are serving life without parole sentences. But in California, yeah, Kayla is one of those, about less than 200. And I think you know, the reason the number is so small is that like that is the definition of life without parole. Like what the sentence means is that you will never have a chance to parole. Like the parole process you went through, like that sentence says you shouldn't get that, and that you are going to die in prison. No one with the sentence is ever supposed to get out, and so it's already like huge odds stacked against you. But then here in California, we've seen like these slight shifts due in the past few years due to changes in legislation largely, and then like Kaylu said, some of these commutations which are a bit unprecedented too. Like you didn't see a lot of commutations before the past few years, and so those two categories, I think, Kaylu, you were 18, right? People who were under the age of 18, that's like one category that we kind of think of as what we call JLWOPs, juvenile life without parole. They were sentenced when they were, or they committed crimes when they were under the age of 18, and so from there, you're no longer allowed to do that in California. It's illegal to sentence a child, and that's because we've realized, like adolescent development, the development of your brain, it's still largely developing, and you don't have the same culpability as a child, and so anyone that legislation is retroactive. So anyone who was under the age of 18 when they were sentenced, now they're getting these chances to go before the parole board. And so that you see that, and then also, yeah, this commutation process, which Kayla can speak to, is just an extreme rarity. Like we don't really have the behind the scenes of what happens in the governor's office and how they determine who will be granted a commutation, but they're just really few and far between. So yeah, I think that's part of the reason why the number is so small.
No, it's really compelling, especially how you both laid this out, and to the point about Caleb being only 18, and we'll bring it up later in the conversation because that's a really important context for us to key in on. But Caleb, like Amanda said, it's a rarity there, and you've hinted as well too. This sentence is something that's meant to be for life, and how did you? Words may not be able to describe this, but how did you feel when you found out you were in fact being released?
Man, whew, you're trying to get me. I'm not gonna do it. It ain't gonna make me cry, right? It was honestly like saying that I get a second chance, another opportunity to do it totally different. That's an understatement, and I don't know if I should say this, but I was prepared to spend the rest of my life in prison because, like Amanda said, the sentence itself means that you're not redeemable, right? And I kind of wanted to challenge that thought process. Like, I am redeemable. So let me work on myself. Let me be the best version of myself I possibly can. So I did everything I possibly could. When the education opportunities presented itself, I took advantage of it. When I needed to access self-help, when they didn't have it available, I took correspondent courses because I really want to be the best version of myself I possibly could, not only for myself, but for my family and those that supported me. I felt like I let them down, early on when I was younger, and my brother and siblings always allowed my nieces and nephews to come visit me. And here I am always with this positive advice, but I'm sitting in prison. And early on, I was still doing negative things though. Right. So, to be released and to now be a brother, to participate fully in my family, to contribute in a positive way to my community, that means the world to me. When you take from your community, you terrorize your community, like I did, through my actions, I wanted to reverse that, to say, look, change is possible. I think second chances are important.
They're definitely important, and even even right now, it's I'm feeling I feel the emotion, and you talked a lot about your family, your community, and you know once this sets in and becomes reality that you're going to be stepping back into society, into your community, I'm curious, and I know the audience would love to understand a little bit more as well. As how are you supported in this transition? What did it look like? Who was there? What resources were available to you?
Well, from a state standpoint, the state didn't offer me anything financial, medical, dental, any of that stuff, right? So I'm married. Um, my wife has been there, man, for years. Um, from financial, spiritual, emotional support, my brothers and my sisters. When they knew I was coming home, we kind of made arrangements because every month, you go to the store if you're um, so lucky to have that type of support where your family and friends, send you money to access the store for hygiene, food, whatever. Instead of me spending everything that they sent, I used to save it, you know, um, so I can, come home and take care of my hygiene and underclothes and clothing. So it was family and friends that was integral in me being able to do that. Other than that, I didn't have any money. I was incarcerated from 18 to 50.
You're listening to Rights and Wrongs, a weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm speaking with Kiilu, Washington, and Amanda Leavell about the reintegration of people sentenced to life without parole. So, Amanda, we've been touching upon some of these contexts behind Kiilu's sentencing, and earlier in our conversation, we were talking about some of the context as to from an ethnic background to an age background that influenced ultimately the sentencing that he was given. The data shows that more than a third of California's life without parole inmates are Black. So, could you share your perspective on what role race may play in these sentencing decisions?
Yeah, wow. That's a big question. I think sometimes it's hard to grasp like the gravity of like those racial disparities. Like even that statistic that you mentioned that I think it's about maybe 35% of people serving LWOP in California are Black. That doesn't hold as much weight until you realize like the larger context that only 5% of California's population is Black. So it's not just that 35%, it's that across, think about the Black population in California. And it's not just in California. I think people of color are overrepresented among those serving life sentences in pretty much every state in the country. And yeah, I think it boils down to just racism and bias that, we've documented that at almost every stage of the criminal legal system. People of color, particularly African Americans, are disproportionately arrested and convicted. And yeah, I think it's just that systemic bias and that racism that's just at the core of our system. I don't have anything more elaborate than that.
No, I mean that no, that says it all. And I want, if I may follow up on this point, because you both mentioned at the top of the conversation, I mentioned that Kaylu was only 45 days into 18 years old, and in the midst of our conversation, we're talking about this perspective on youth, and how an individual, what's the difference between 17-year-old someone 17 years old and 300 days versus 18-year-old and 100 days. It's Kaylee was only just 18 when he received this sentence. So how should age be factored into how life sentences, specifically those without parole, are given out?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I could see Kaylee shaking his head when you're asking what's the difference between that 17-year-old and that 18-year-old. And that's, I think what we largely see, and it's not just us, I referenced this earlier, but just brain science. Like I think one of the things I always think about is the way that we see age, we see it and we respect it in every other part of our lives. So I don't know if you know about like, okay, the drinking age in the US is 21, but like to rent a car, that they have extremely high premiums if you're under the age of 25 because they know you don't want to give 24, 25 year olds cars and go driving around and have the same insurance level because they're different. Like our brains are different and you're still fully developing. And I think, yeah, that's part of just, it's just you think about Kaylu just being, I can't believe that it was that few amount of days between a huge change in what your life could have looked like, and like how you're sentenced. And I think we just are hoping that, especially as we start seeing like a lot of these stories from this report are both people who are under the age of 18, but a lot of people who are over the age of 18, and you see there really isn't a big difference.
It's not a big difference, and that's something we really want to hone in on, because Kiilu's experience is like, as you mentioned, 3-4 months earlier we may be having a whole different conversation, a whole different scenario, but how things are set up, that's presently, that's the reality. It's an unfortunate one, but Kiilu, your case shows that, and as you mentioned it earlier, is that people can be redeemed. You've mentioned, and even in the report outlines how you've been volunteering and mentoring incarcerated youth at your local juvenile detention centers, providing classes on a variety of initiatives and subjects, including entrepreneurship. I want to ask you, how has your experience informed your approach to mentorship and your approach to community?
Well, I wish growing up that I had somebody to look up to that kind of, walked me through some things in life that I would experience, as a youth. And so I'm looking to be that for these young people that's already in trouble. And one of the first conversations we have is like, the best of your thinking landed you here in this juvenile system. Why not think differently? Why not try something differently? And then I share my personal experiences, the decisions I made before I was 18, right after I turned 18, and the end result of those decisions, right? One of the things that always kind of catches their attention is when I came home, my wife gave me a credit card, put me on her credit. So I had a little cash. And every time we went to the store, I spent my cash. And she used to say, "Why are you always spending your cash? Use your credit card." And I leaned over and whispered in her ear, "I don't know how to use a credit card." Right. So that's one of the things that they admit. They never had a credit card, know anything about credit, how to establish credit, never had a checking and savings account. So I find that interesting because these are the things that I had to learn up on my release. And I put some documents together, make these packets, and every week I try to teach them something that I know they don't know, and I'm praying that it's impactful and interesting, where they can get out and be comfortable and strive to be a positive part of their community as opposed to being, negative influence in their community. And it's fulfilling, to be honest.
I can only imagine. And, I want to pose one more question to the both of you as we near the end of our conversation. And I think this is a way to, round out our conversations in a beautiful way. And I appreciate both of you for the time already. I want to ask this question to Amanda first, and then I'll ask you as well, Kiilu. But Amanda, from just the work that you've done in the report as well, could you share your perspective on, why are second chances so important?
Wow. That's big. That's almost, I think, probably it's philosophical. I think people like Kiilu, some of the people that we interviewed for this report, they are some of my biggest inspirations. And like, I think it's part of, I think, just what makes us human in a way, like there's a really powerful quote in the report. Oh, I'm going to butcher it, but I think it was Kenneth Hartman, which Kenneth, I don't even think we've met, but I'm going to put a plug out. He has a book that apparently I have read some of it and it's amazing. And he was sentenced to life without parole, but he's brilliant. And this quote is, it's almost poetic, but he says something along the lines of like, while like life without parole it's like terrible for us, right? Not me. I wasn't sentenced, but for the people who were sentenced to life without parole, it's a terrible thing. But he says it's far worse for like society as a whole to conclude that people, like humans, like can't be better than they were at their worst moments. And like, to me, that's so powerful because it's like, if we don't have second chances, if we don't have grace and forgiveness, like it really feels like there's no hope for humanity. And I think it's heavy. These things are heavy. It's not easy to talk about these things sometimes. um it's hard, but it's what gives me, I think, hope in humanity.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, even this conversation, it's giving me a lot of hope, and it's giving me a lot of grace and appreciation for where we all are right now in life. And Kiilu, I want to ask you the same question as well. Why do you think second chances are so important?
Oh man, I would not have had this opportunity if it was not for earning the opportunity, a second chance, right? And I think it's important because I have something to contribute to society. Being neglected as a young person, I want to be there for them. I don't want to neglect them. I want to let them know that I see you, that I can actually help you, that I can contribute in a positive way. Most of the young people that I deal with, they don't have a positive male role model in their life, right? If I didn't have this second chance, I would be doing the same thing I'm doing now, just behind the wall, So I'm not the same person that I was at 18, 45 days to my 18th birthday. It didn't take me to be 50 to make a change. I've changed in my late 20s. I spent my 30s, my 40s, and, finally, thank God, was released at 50. It didn't take that long for me to change. So I'm not the same person. So I think it's important to realize that, like Kenneth said, the worst choice that you made as a young person shouldn't define who you are.
No, not at all. Not at all. And, on that note, it's been a powerful conversation. I have a lot of emotions and I have a lot of thoughts, but a lot of appreciation, more so than anything, for the both of you. I want to thank you, Kiilu. I want to thank you, Amanda, for the conversation today. And I know our audience appreciates it. So thank you both.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
You've been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Blair Palmer and Christina Varganova. Our engineer is myself, Kosi Ogbuli. In next week's episode of Rights and Wrongs, we'll be talking about China's crackdown on Hong Kong dissidents. Please join us again then. Goodbye for now.